How will immigration affect this year's US presidential race? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Immigration is a hot-button issue in this year's US presidential election. Republican Party candidate Donald Trump blames his rival Kamala Harris for presiding over an influx of millions of undocumented migrants into the United States. But the vice president's campaign insists she can fix what her own administration admits is a crisis at the southern border. With more on how both sides are framing the challenge of illegal immigration, CGTN's Benji Haya has this report.
This is America's border czar, and she's failed us. Under Harris, over 10 million illegally here.
Donald Trump's attack lines on Kamala Harris laid bare in political ads like this one.
Do you have any plans to visit the border?
At some point.
Then she just lied.
The border is secure.
Trump is promising tougher actions, deportations on an unprecedented scale. A stark contrast, he suggests, to the current administration's policies.
Kamala voted in favor of deadly sanctuary cities. She supports decriminalizing illegal border crossings, and she supports mass amnesty for all illegals. Think of that. Everybody coming in right now. And many of these people are coming out of the prisons and the mental institutions. They're going to get amnesty. She wants everybody to have amnesty.
Lots of those claims are without evidence. There's no proof that countries around the world are emptying mental asylums and sending inmates to the US-Mexico border, a common allegation from Trump that conflates mental asylums with asylum seekers. He's also repeatedly used inflammatory language about immigrants, quote, poisoning the blood of the United States. And his pledge to build a wall along the whole border, paid for by Mexico? That didn't happen, not by a long stretch. But he is correct in highlighting that there have been millions of apprehensions at the border under Joe Biden's presidency, far more than under his watch. It's a record that Trump is now associating with the vice president, who was given the responsibility for tackling migration at its source in Central and South American nations.
On the border, the choice is simple. Kamala Harris supports increasing the number of Border Patrol agents. Donald Trump blocked a bill to increase the number of Border Patrol agents.
Yet Kamala Harris is hitting back at Trump for blocking bipartisan legislation that would have provided additional funding for border security.
Entering the country.
Kamala Harris has spent decades fighting violent crime. As a border state prosecutor, she took on drug cartels.
Her adverts point to him as the problem and promote her as the solution.
She backed the toughest border control bill in decades.
We know our immigration system is broken, and we know what it takes to fix it. Comprehensive reform that includes, yes, strong border security and an earned pathway to citizenship.
Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have already taken some steps to address the crisis. The president issued an executive order in June limiting how many migrants can claim asylum at the border when the numbers get too high. The quantity of those apprehended by US Border Patrol agents dropped dramatically in recent months, and more than 4 million migrants have been turned away or deported during Biden's term. That hasn't de-incentivized the caravan of migrants still seeking a life in the US. Scenes like this have led to polls like this. AP this month finding that Americans trust Trump over Harris on immigration, a top priority for voters, with the days until they cast their ballots quickly counting down. Benji Haya, CGTN, Washington.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Douglas Sloan is principal at the National Capital Strategy Group. Out of Delaware, Brandon Brice is secretary of the Delaware Republican Party and a conservative columnist. Also in the U.S. Capitol, Jackie Luqman is coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace, D.C. And from Mexico City, we're joined by Laura Carlsen. She is the executive director of the Mexico City-based international relations think tank, MIRA, Feminisms and Democracies. Welcome to all of you. Laura Carlsen, let's start in Mexico City. The United States media is reporting that there's been a 60% drop in migrants seeking refuge along the United States southern border with Mexico. There's also been a 50% drop in the number of migrants arrested at the border. Now, there are many politicians here in the United States who would like to take credit for that, but isn't this because of heavier enforcement of laws in Mexico by Mexican authorities? Hasn't Mexico been doing the heavy lifting here?
Yes, indeed it has, and it's had tragic consequences on people who are seeking asylum and people who are migrating through Mexico. Ever since Donald Trump threatened to place tariffs on Mexican imports, there's been a binational policy of containing, that is to say, stopping flows of migrants through Mexico to the United States. So it's basically what's happening here is that they're just displacing migratory flows, and the reasons that people leave have not improved, which means that they continue to leave from most countries. We've seen a lot of changes in the migration from Central America to Venezuela and Cuba and countries all over the world that has to do with the inequality and the poverty and the injustice that is now part of a global system. So Mexico has taken on these tasks, but it's creating a very volatile situation, and not just for Mexico. Of course, it creates a vast problem of violation of human rights for migrants and for their families. Under international law, migrants have a right to ask for asylum, and putting caps like Biden did on this is not a good solution because it violates international laws and it violates their rights. And many who desperately need safety are being denied even the chance to ask for it. Some of the other policies that are coming up in the United States that would look to legalizing families, to stabilizing families, you know, people who have been in the United States working for years, part of their communities, are far more stable and reasonable solutions than continuing to make Mexico do the dirty work while the root causes of migration have not been addressed, and in many ways are exacerbated by U.S. policies.
Right, and Laura, very briefly, those asylum seekers that are being stopped in Mexico, they're being held in Mexico, what do you know of their fate?
Well, there's a terrible situation in border towns where they are living in very precarious situations, and probably the most concerning is that they become prey to delinquency and organized criminal gangs, which just makes the gangs stronger. They've already been strengthened by the difficulty of migrating through to the United States, because now migrants are oftentimes forced to migrate with criminal organizations. It's enriched them incredibly, the kind of crackdown on migration that they're seeing. And then there are a lot more who are being deported and sent back to countries, and often being sent back to situations that are completely untenable for family life.
Douglas Sloan, you know, as Laura points out, President Joe Biden has decided that he will put a cap on the number of people seeking asylum at the southern border. How would that work? How do you put a cap on the number of people when they could all be eligible for asylum?
Yeah, that is the question of the hour that Joe Biden and obviously Kamala Harris are going to have to work out in terms of trying to stem the tide of immigration into this country. Like the speaker before me said, people do have a right, according to international law, to seek asylum, to avoid or rather get away from violence and dire circumstances within their country. It is very interesting that that is one of the key points. Immigration and border crossing is one of the key points of Trump's campaign, and yet we've seen a 32% drop since June. It's incredible. This is something that even this is the Democratic strategist's greatest dream to see this happen. But in terms of you know, getting down to the brass tacks of determining who gets asylum and who doesn't, can really be a sticky situation for Joe Biden.
All right, Douglas, I just want to look at the impact this issue is going to have on the election. I mean, we are hearing and we're getting data that immigrants are becoming U.S. citizens at a faster rate in a decade. Their applications to become U.S. citizens are being processed at a very fast rate. This will also make them eligible to vote in the upcoming presidential election. And I'm wondering, how big an impact will these new immigrants have on the outcome of the election?
Well, I don't know if they're going to have a huge impact. They are processing people at a faster rate. It's interesting that many of the immigrants coming over the southern border are Latino immigrants, and depending upon what's happening, that can split either way. Often, some of the Latino immigrants tend to support Republicans and will support Donald Trump. So it actually could work against Biden. But the way things are coming through regarding Kamala and her barnstorming, she was just in North Carolina giving her speech on her new economic policy. North Carolina hasn't been in play for 16 years, but the numbers are showing that it's now coming into play. So we're really seeing a strong campaign from Kamala. I don't think that new immigrants voting in this election are going to have too much of an effect on that.
All right, I want to get to Kamala Harris's economic policies in detail a little later in the show. Douglas, Brandon, Brice, of course, there are a number of issues on which people will cast their votes, but how big an issue will immigration be in this election?
It's interesting. I actually think in this case, it's not so much the policies of immigration, but how illegal immigration is impacting residents who have already been in the United States. If you just look at cities like New York and Chicago, many urban communities are saying, well, wait a minute, how is it that an illegal immigrant can get services that people who were born here, lived here, raised here still cannot get? I think that's very problematic for Joe Biden. I think the problem is that when you hear the term, I know we heard the term black job from Trump, I think most Americans knew what he was trying to say, but I don't think it was actually articulated well in terms of saying that, when you talk about undercutting the market, people who have immigrated here, seek refuge here, are willing to take certain jobs that certain other communities may not actually take, or may not actually accept, or may not be interested in taking. So there is an economic impact when you talk about how this impacts the election and what people will vote for. But I also think when you look at this illegal immigration, we've been talking about this for years, and very few people have actually moved towards a real solution. The reality is, if Biden couldn't do it in 4 years, Kamala's not going to do it in 4 years if she's successful in November. And so I think what we need to look at is the economic impact that it's causing people and Americans today, and I think that's going to be the biggest factor when we talk about November's election.
All right, and Brandon, I mean, you talk about jobs. I mean, Donald Trump is of the view that migrants, as he has pointed out, steal jobs. But if we look at research that's been done, pretty detailed research, and we had a report that was put out by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it shows that migrants have actually kept this economy afloat in the post-pandemic period, contrary to what Donald Trump has been saying.
First of all, I'll be honest with you. When you look at cities like New York City, any melting pot creates economic opportunity. We know that. But again, when we talk about election seasons, when we talk about, you get some people who feel that these migrants are, in a sense, taking the jobs that should be going to them. Donald Trump is a wordsmith. We know that. And when you look at, people vote their pocketbooks. And when people have issues, they don't necessarily think rational. They think, how am I keeping my job? How am I getting access to affordable health care? How am I actually, being able to afford groceries, i.e. the inflation? Words matter. And I think this is a president that, whether you like him or not, he's created the atmosphere where his words actually are something that plays towards the election. I think it's actually, in his case, it's easier for him to try to explain how does this actually impact residents versus saying, well, it's just a black job, or as he said, it's a Hispanic job. I think that might have been problematic. But if Donald Trump can actually articulate in these upcoming debates how this actually impacts Americans when people who come from other countries seeking asylums impact those job markets, then I think he could be competitive. If he can't, then I think it's going to be a toss-up in November.
Jackie, Luqman, of course, there's still a large number of people seeking asylum at the southern border, seeking entry into the United States. Many, of course, are fleeing South and Central America because of a number of issues. There is extreme violence in many of these countries. There's political instability, there's poverty. Now, the current Democrat candidate for president, Kamala Harris, is also the vice president, and she was charged with this issue of migration. One of the policies that was adopted was big investments in Central America so that migrants would stay in those countries. They wouldn't be forced to move northwards, trying to seek a new life in the United States. What happened to all those policies?
Well, first of all, you're correct. Harris was in charge of immigration policy as vice president, and the first speech she made in carrying out that responsibility was, I believe it was in Mexico. I'm blanking a little bit on the location, but she literally told people from other countries, do not come here.
Yep.
Do not come. She said that in public, in front of the podium, news, all over the news. Joe Biden himself announced that he would waive 26 federal laws in Texas in order to build a section of the border wall. So this idea that the Biden-Harris administration or the Harris-Walz administration or any Democratic administration is going to do anything better or less harmful than a Republican administration, any Republican administration, Trump or anybody else, that's just facetious. That's just not true, because clearly one of the strategies of the Democratic Party has always been to appeal to being further to the right than Republicans on some issues in order to draw votes from those so-called moderate Republicans, instead of addressing the actual problem that creates this immigration issue. And this is not illegal immigration. Human beings are not illegal. They have an international right to seek asylum. That's not illegal either. The problem is U.S. imperialism meddling in other countries' elections, and particularly in the global South. Coups in those countries when the people choose leaders from among themselves who favor policies that are not capitalist focused, that if they want socialism, that should be their right as a self-determined sovereign nation for their people to choose that. But of course, if the U.S. government and its allies are going to invest in capitalist ventures in other countries, they don't want socialism because that will mess up their profits. Yeah. So the United States makes sure they prop up governments in these countries, the leaders in these countries that the people do not want. So there's always all of this political chaos, and then the administration responds with brutal military responses, and people leave because they cannot live in the countries because of U.S. foreign policy. So if we were to address that, if the U.S. got out of global South countries and left people alone to run their own countries, the immigration issue would not be an issue.
Right, Laura Carlsen, on that issue that Jackie Luqman talks about, I mean, to what extent have U.S. government policies, and I'm talking about policies pursued by both Democrats and Republicans, and these go back decades, contribute to the flow of migrants northwards. I mean, we've seen interference in countries, we've seen destabilization of countries, destabilization of governments, indiscriminate use of sanctions, as well as, you know, the huge drugs market in the United States, which creates that drugs industry in Central and South America, and of course we've seen the violence that's fueled by that industry as well. I mean, can there really be reform if those root causes are not addressed?
It's very complicated, as you've mentioned a number of the most important factors. That's why Kamala Harris's mandate to go to root causes was doomed from the start. First of all, if you look at that phase of immigration from Central America, her counterparts were Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, who was propped up by the United States government and is now in prison as a narco dictator. The other one was Alejandro Giammattei, who was ruling over one of the most authoritarian and corrupt governments in the world. And now that government has changed, and it'll be the Guatemalan people's responsibility to see if they can remake their country after that. And then you look at what's happening now, and we have a change in the migrants, and many of them are coming from Venezuela and Cuba. And while there's other factors involved, certainly, the sanctions that have been imposed by the United States government on Venezuela and Cuba, according to all the studies that have been made, have had a profound impact on the economic conditions and thus on the immigration and out-migration from those two countries. So you have a situation where the right hand doesn't care what the left hand is doing, and the policies are at loggerheads, and this creates a security industry where companies are making millions and millions of dollars to try to crack down on a border that is continually being fed by new flows of migrants because other policies are making their lives impossible in their countries of origin. All migrants, almost all migrants, would prefer to stay where they are if they could have a decent life in their home countries.
Douglas Sloan, let's turn to something you mentioned a moment ago, and that is Kamala Harris's address on the economy, well, her policies for the economy. It was billed as her first major policy speech on Friday afternoon. She focused on the economy and said she would fight corporations and bring down the costs of commodities, the costs of food, costs of housing. Let's listen to somewhat of what she had to say.
As president, I will be laser focused on creating opportunities for the middle class that advance their economic security, stability, and dignity. Together, we will build what I call an opportunity economy.
So Douglas, spell this out for us. What does she mean by an opportunity economy?
Well, I think what she's doing is a logical progression from in building on what Joe Biden started with his jobs economy. We see the job numbers for Biden have looked great since the COVID recovery. New job numbers coming in the first quarter of this calendar year look great, but we still are dealing with inflation. So if the food prices are high, if the gas prices are high, if the cost of living is high, it's great that you can get a job. It's great that jobs are available, but American families are still suffering. So what she's talking about is really working to lower the cost of living for American families. And that's really music to many people's ears. She's talking about expanded child tax credit. She's talking about stopping food price gouging. She's talking about $25,000 in assistance for down payment for housing. And that is some of the things that Americans need at this stage in the game to try to make their way in this economy, which is improving because we are now seeing a drop in inflation for the first time. The inflation has dropped to its lowest rate in 3 years. So we're really looking at an improvement since Biden has taken over. And I believe with Kamala's new opportunity economy, we will see even more improvement for American families going forward.
Brandon, Brice, Kamala Harris has said she wants to put an end to price gouging at the grocery store. And as Douglas pointed out, to be fair, the Federal Reserve has brought down the rate of inflation in the United States. And that happened during Biden's term, during the Biden-Harris term, I should say. But Donald Trump has fired back. This is what he had to say.
Now Kamala is reportedly proposing communist price controls. She wants price controls. And if they worked, I'd go along with it too, but they don't work. They actually have the exact opposite impact and effect. But it leads to food shortages, rationing, hunger, dramatically more inflation.
Right. Now, Brandon, if we look at some of what Donald Trump is proposing, I mean, he's proposing a national tax on basic necessities, amending the Affordable Care Act, that's the provision of health services in the United States. And he also has spoken repeatedly about cutting Medicare. I mean, isn't that going to cause a lot of hardship for people, especially people who are in the lower income group?
Well, you know, first of all, when you talk about any impact of government overregulation impacts and hurts the common guy. You know, I think one of the issues that I had with what Donald Trump actually said is that, you know, he didn't focus on really the inflation issue, which right now is still high. I don't know what folks are talking about. We still have high inflation. But let's go back to Kamala for a minute, because in her speech, when she's talking about this is a woman who has been vice president for 4 years. Her and Joe Biden have not done this then. And what makes you think they're going to do this now? And matter of fact, we can't even get her to tell this plant in an interview. This candidate is actually running from interviews where people are asking, what's your plan for the economy? So, you know, I'm not sure if these are sound bites or if this all of us, I mean, it's almost as if the Democratic Party is trying to rebrand this candidate where it's saying, if the person didn't do it 4 years ago, what makes you say they're going to do it now? It just, to me, it's kind of suspect.
Okay, let me give Douglas a chance to respond to that. Douglas, please, if you could keep this brief.
Well, I think you made a great point. If the person couldn't do it 4 years ago, what makes you think he's going to do it now? Trump couldn't do it 4 years ago. He's not going to be able to do it now. The Republicans are very good at criticizing. They're very good at trying to push other people's plans down, but they often don't have a plan of their own. A perfect example is with healthcare, Obamacare. He wants to get rid of Obamacare, but he does not have a solid alternative. And this is just part of the Republican playbook. Kamala and the Democrats are preaching positivity and moving forward, and that's what we need to focus on right now.
Right, Jackie Luqman, Kamala Harris making a lot of promises. She also wants to bring down taxes. What are your thoughts? Can she deliver?
I'm trying really hard not to laugh at all of this, because this is it all sounds good, but the implementation, I mean, the devil is in the details, and the implementation seems really iffy. First of all, real quick, communist price controls is just typical Republican or conservative, anything but capitalism propaganda. If you control prices, more things become available for more people. So the producers and the suppliers still make their money by reducing prices, but more people can afford your products. That's what price controls actually do. It keeps corporations from ripping the consumers off, which is what they're doing right now. But the problem with Kamala's economic policies is that her answer to solving these problems is to give tax incentives and other kinds of breaks to the very people who are causing the problems. Like her solution for dealing with medical debt is to give the hospitals incentives for canceling medical debt. Well, they and the insurance companies are the reasons medical debts are so high. She wants to control prices by fining grocery stores that price gouge. Well, grocery stores are not the only entity that set prices. The suppliers negotiate prices with the grocery stores. So it seems to me that her policies are still very soft on the corporate side of responsibilities. So we're not really going to solve these problems with these policies.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.